Today, you will hear some real and frightening stories that occurred inside funeral homes. Before we begin, I ask that you leave a like and subscribe to contribute to this channel and motivate us to bring more videos like this. That said, let's get to the stories. There are places where silence should reign, the final resting place, where those who have departed find eternal rest. But what if that silence were broken by something inexplicable? It was a winter night. Carlos, a young employee at the funeral home, was finishing his shift. The room was empty, illuminated only by the dim light of the lamps. The coffins were closed, and everything seemed normal until a low, almost imperceptible sound began to echo down the hallway. It sounded like a whisper. Carlos stopped, trying to understand where it was coming from. The sound intensified, and he began to feel a chill run down his spine. He approached one of the coffins, believing that something was wrong. Perhaps it was some animal or just a trick of his mind. But the sound continued, a soft voice asking for help. Trembling, he opened the coffin, certain that he would find only the lifeless body he had prepared hours earlier. But when he opened it, what he saw left him speechless. The eyes of the figure in the coffin were open, and it seemed to be smiling. Desperate, Carlos ran, but the sound kept chasing him. Whispering voices, soft laughter. Since then, he has never been the same. Carlos quit his job the next morning, but what he saw that night still haunts him. But what about you? Would you open a coffin if you heard a voice asking for help? Not every goodbye is silent. In some farewells, souls seem to refuse to depart, as if something still binds them to the world of the living. Marta had worked at the funeral home for years, accustomed to the painful farewells of families that night. While arranging the flowers for a ceremony at dawn, a strange detail caught her attention on one of the coffins. A red rose was positioned in an unusual way. It looked as if someone had pressed it against the deceased's chest with great force, but no one but her had access to the place at that hour. Intrigued, Marta stepped back, but a chilling breeze swept through the room. The flowers began to wilt, and a heavy aroma of something burning filled the air. Marta felt as if she were being watched. She turned and saw, reflected in the glass of the next room, the figure of the deceased. Standing there, holding the rose, frozen with fear, Marta felt something pushing her, a force invisible. In panic, she fled. The next morning, everything seemed normal, but upon reviewing the security footage, there it was, a shadow moving on its own. Perhaps his last goodbye had not been given. Marta quit her job soon after, but she could never shake the feeling that someone or something was following her. But what about you? Would you have the courage to go back to work after a night like that? In the darkness of the early morning, the solitude of a funeral home can become terrifying. Some believe that on certain nights, the dead receive visitors. Ricardo was in charge of the night shift at the funeral home. The hours were long, but he was used to the silence. That night, something felt different. The clock read 2:40 a.m., and at 5 a.m. he heard the sound of slow footsteps echoing in the hallway. Intrigued and slightly uneasy, Ricardo thought that a relative might have entered without permission for one last goodbye. He approached the main hall and saw in the distance the silhouette of a man bent over one of the coffins, whispering incomprehensible words. As Ricardo got closer, the figure slowly straightened up. Without showing his face, he turned and walked towards the exit. Ricardo followed him, but when he crossed the door, there was no one there. The street was deserted. He returned to the hall to check the coffin, and that's when he realized something terrifying. The coffin was empty. The body had vanished. Confused and terrified, Ricardo began searching for the body in the hallways, but only found emptiness when he reviewed the footage the next morning. There was the figure of the man leaning over the coffin, but slowly disappearing like a shadowy blur, fading without a trace. To this day, no one has been able to explain what happened to the body that night. Did it really disappear, or was it taken somewhere else? Ricardo never worked the night shift again. But what about you? Would you have the courage to face the shadows of a night shift? Some objects carry more than just reflections. There are mirrors that hold dark memories and stories that should not be recalled. Juliana was new on the job. In one of the rooms of the funeral home, there was an old mirror, worn by time, strategically placed for families to gather themselves after farewells. But Juliana soon realized that this mirror was not like the others. Whenever she walked by it, she felt as if she saw something more, someone behind her, someone who wasn't there. One night, while cleaning the room, she noticed a strange movement in the reflection. It was a figure, a woman in an old dress, pale with an empty gaze. The woman stood still, staring at Juliana through the mirror. When she turned around, there was nothing behind her. The hall was empty. In the following days, Juliana avoided passing near that mirror. But the figure seemed to draw closer each time. One night, when facing it, she saw the woman beside her, almost touching her shoulder, her heart racing. Juliana tried to leave the room, but she felt a pressure, an invisible force holding her back. The figure then whispered something incomprehensible. When she finally managed to move, Juliana ran. The next day, she left without explanation. Later, she learned that the woman in the mirror was a young girl who had passed away decades before and whose family had never said their final goodbye. The funeral home still keeps the mirror, and it is said that sometimes, if you look closely, you can see the woman asking for one last chance to be remembered. But beware, not everyone manages to leave after the encounter. But what about you? Would you have the courage to look into that mirror? Not all souls manage to depart in peace. Some, especially the younger ones, seem to become trapped in a world between ours and the unknown, seeking companionship, or perhaps just a friend. Eduardo, a longtime employee of the funeral home, used to say that the preparation room always felt colder than the rest of the building, but he never thought much of it, until the night he saw something that would mark him forever. It was an ordinary night when a sound of childish laughter echoed through the room. Initially, Eduardo thought it was his imagination. After all, a child's laughter in a funeral home at that hour was something impossible. However, the sound repeated, and he realized it came from the corner of the room, where a small wooden chair was placed. Eduardo watched, too scared to approach but curious enough not to leave. Suddenly, a red balloon rolled across the floor and stopped at his feet. He couldn't understand where it had come from, as there was nothing in the area to explain the object. Scared but trying to remain rational, Eduardo picked up the balloon and kept it. The next night, the laughter returned, and this time he had an even more disturbing vision. The figure of a child standing next to the coffin. She had an empty gaze and a look of sadness, as if she were lost. He tried to approach, but the figure disappeared, leaving the balloon on the ground once again. In the following weeks, the presence of the child intensified. Eduardo, tormented by the vision, requested a transfer to another department. He soon discovered that, years earlier, a child had been laid to rest there under tragic circumstances, and her family had not been able to give her a proper goodbye. To this day, it is said that one can hear the childish laughter, and that the balloon mysteriously appears, always on very calm nights. Some say it is the child seeking companionship. But what about you? If you found that balloon, would you try to take it away or leave it for someone in need? In some funeral homes, there are places even the staff avoid, spots that seem to carry the weight of something dark and unknown, like the basement. Renata was new on the job and had been warned to stay away from the basement of the funeral home where old materials were stored. The explanation was that the place wasn't safe due to mold and darkness. But on a stormy night, she heard something coming from there. A slow knocking, as if someone were calling for help. At first, Renata ignored it, thinking it was just the wind or some object falling. But the knocking continued, insistent, almost rhythmic, and it seemed to be getting closer. She took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to investigate. As she descended the narrow stairs, she felt the air grow dense, almost suffocating. The flashlight's beam flickered, and the silence was broken only by the sound of her breathing and the echo of the knocks. When she reached the bottom, she noticed an old door locked with chains. The sound of knocking was coming from there, now louder, as if something were trying to get out. Renata took a step back, frightened, and then a weak, dragged-out voice began to whisper her name. Renata! The flashlight flickered for a moment, and when the light returned, the knocking had stopped, but the chains on the door were slightly loose. She ran back upstairs but felt that something had followed her since that night. Renata swore she could hear whispers and knocks in any room where she was alone. The experience marked her deeply, and she refused to go down to the basement again. The basement remains locked, and no one knows what really happened down there. They say that from time to time, the door still emits a solitary knock, as if waiting for someone to open it. But what about you? Would you have the courage to go down to the basement and see what's on the other side of the door? Some say that flowers are symbols of farewell. But what if a flower refused to wilt? Could it carry a dark secret, something that should have remained buried? Felipe, a young assistant, was responsible for preparing the room before the wakes. One of the rituals included placing flowers next to the coffins, and he was already accustomed to the process. But one day, while arranging a funeral for an elderly woman, he noticed something peculiar about one flower. A white lily placed in the coffin seemed to be in perfect condition, unlike all the other flowers that were beginning to wilt. Whenever he entered the room alone, he felt the aroma of the lily fill the air, and a sense of presence enveloped him, as if the woman were there watching. One night, he heard soft footsteps, and when he turned around, he saw a pale figure wearing the same dress the woman had worn at the wake, holding the lily. She didn't say anything, just stared at him with a deep, melancholic gaze before vanishing into the darkness. The next day, the flower was once again in perfect condition at the center of the room. The funeral home still keeps the lily in the parlor, and it is said that it never wilts. Always vivid, as if it were a reminder. Some believe it is the woman leaving her mark, a final goodbye that was never complete. But what about you? Would you touch this flower knowing where it comes from?